Um, if Robin, who is my mirror, as you recall from a few weeks ago, was here, if I started to walk out dressed like this to go to Bible class, she'd have said, that won't work. But I didn't go home today, so that's why I'm wearing this. So I try to keep a little bit of a standard. So we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and we're just at the end of question 3 on that lesson. And I had a grand time going through some of this today. Really, really enjoyed it. Hope that I'll be able to share with you some things that I learned today that I didn't know before. So let's begin with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you so much for another beautiful day and for the blessing of safe arrival and health that allows us all to be here. Just the blessing of this opportunity to be together. The freedom that we have to assemble and to open your word together and study together and enjoy the fellowship that we have in Christ. We pray, Father, that we'll never take any of these blessings for granted. Recognize that it's because of your grace and mercy towards us that we enjoy this. We pray your presence with us as we study. Help us to understand the things that were left, the fundamental and foundational truths that Paul is presenting here about your Son and his death and resurrection, and how important that is for us. We love you so much, and we thank you for Jesus and the relationship with you and with each other that he created for us in his death on the cross, and it's in his name that we pray. Amen. So, at the end of class last week, we were talking about question 3, what was the foundation of Paul's gospel? And verse 3 here of chapter 15 is almost verbatim. For what I received, I passed on to you, as what he wrote back in chapter 11 and verse 23 when he's talking about the Lord's Supper. And both the Lord's Supper and the resurrection are essential matters with regards to our faith. It goes right back to the beginning during Jesus' ministry and at the end. And there's 4 major points that Paul's going to make here as part of the foundation. The first one is that he died, and not just that he died, because all of us will die, but that he died for our sins, and he said that was with agreement and in agreement with the scriptures. The second one was that he was buried, and there's no modifier in this case, as he's going to have with the next one. There's no he was buried according to the scriptures. But this burial attests the fact that he died. You don't bury living people. And there are scriptures that go along with that. In fact, I mentioned last week that I think 8 years ago I did a sermon on the burial of Christ, and I asked how many people remembered it, and I think Tammy was the only one that did. So you can look forward to hearing that one, because listen, when we talk about that part of Jesus' life, we talk about his death and we talk about his resurrection. We don't spend a lot of time talking about his burial. Obviously it's an important part because Paul mentions it here. And then the third one is that he was raised on the third day, and again, that's a passive tense. He was raised, and it happened on the third day, and we looked a little bit about the scriptures with regards to that. But then the fourth part, and that's where we left off last week, we just got into it, but what is the fourth foundational thing that Paul mentions here? So he died, he was buried, he was raised, and then what? He appeared. He was seen. Yeah, he appeared. And so it's not just a ephemeral or spiritual event, resurrection. He was truly dead, and his body was truly raised, and that raised body was seen. And he first mentions that it was seen by Cephas, which is Paul's usual identification for Peter. And we talked about the fact that Paul doesn't mention Jesus' appearance to the women, which were first. But that's just not part of Paul's point here. He's not being malicious or ugly or misogynist or anything like that. We don't have a record of this appearance of Jesus to Peter. Luke, the 24th chapter, though, in verse 33 and 34, when the two guys come back from Emmaus, or the man and the woman come back from Emmaus, when they get there, they said, and the Lord has appeared to Peter. So we have a record that it happened. We don't have a record of what happened during that time. And that's where we left off, because after his appearance to Cephas, what does Paul say Jesus appeared to? Then to the 12. And I think I mentioned last week, maybe I didn't, this is the only time that Paul uses this expression for the apostles in any of his epistles. He never refers to them as the 12, except right here. And of course, that would be a reference to not to 12 men, but to 11, because Judas is dead. And it's going to be another week before he's going to appear to all 11. So actually it was just to 10 when he appeared to the 12. Obviously there were going to be other appearances, and that brings us now to question 4. What other people did Jesus appear to after his death and resurrection in verses 6 through 8?
Hey, Dan,
Yes?
before you go there, I just want to say, I don't know if this is important, it doesn't mean anything, I guess, but he appeared to people that knew what he looked like before dying, so that there was no mistake that was him.
Right.
You know, they knew he appeared to them who knew him.
Right. And that's the interesting part of this, because did the people on the road to Emmaus know who he was? Would they have known who he was under normal circumstances? Yes, but he hid his visage to them until he broke bread and gave thanks, and then all of a sudden he allowed them to recognize him, and then what happened to him? He vanished. He disappeared. Which, listen, if you can walk through walls, you can also disappear. I mean, that's just one of the miracles of Jesus. We don't usually think about that as a miracle of Jesus, that he's sitting there eating bread and all of a sudden he's gone. But that happened in Nazareth too. They grabbed hold of him to throw him over the cliff, and he's not there. So these other appearances that Paul's going to mention here in verses 6 through 8 form the bridge between Jesus appearing to the 12, which was actually literally the 10, and his own appearance. Paul's own, the appearance of Jesus to Paul, to Saul of Tarsus. And like we said, the first couple aren't found in our New Testaments. So Paul knows of them either by revelation or by talking to the people that Jesus appeared to. And we'll discuss that as we go along as well. So, and there is, and I'll probably bring this up again, there's a chronology that Paul seems to be following here, because he says that he first appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he says in verse 6, verse 7, then, and verse 8, and last of all. So it seems like he's moving through in a chronological way. That doesn't always happen. In fact, my lesson that I'm just finished working on for Sunday, which is the other 3 groups of people that are leading up to the death of Christ. You know that in all of those I've been putting up this chronology of the last week of Jesus. This week you're not going to see that, because I'd just throw it out the window, because it doesn't pertain to what we're going to be covering this. Anyway, sometimes chronologies work and sometimes they don't. So the first he refers to after that, after the previous events, who did Jesus appear to? What's the next one? 500. Above 500, more than 500, at one time. 500 brethren. And what would we naturally include in this statement, brethren?
Sisters.
Who?
It would have to be the Jews, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, they're all Jews. Men and women. It's a generic term. It's not just saying over 500 male disciples. He's talking about the brethren, the disciples that believe in him. That would include women, yes.
NIV says brothers and sisters.
Yeah, well, they just add that in there, and I know that, but the Greek doesn't have that. They're just helping out us. It's a dynamic equivalent, and they're exactly right in saying that. And somebody else said it, 500 brethren, above 500 brethren, what's the next phrase? At once. So on a single occasion, Jesus appeared to a group we couldn't get into this building legally. Okay, we can hold about 300 people, so 2/3 more than if you had every pew filled here, over that amount. When and where did that happen? Yeah, we don't know. That's a simple answer. However, what do we know about above this above 500 brethren? Most of them were still alive. When was Corinthians written? 55, 54, and the resurrection happened, let's say, 30. So how long has it been? 25. Yeah, 24, 25 years. And still most of these are alive. Yes?
It's not 33 AD?
No. I've changed my mind about that, and most everybody else. Our calendar is incorrect. There was a reign of a king that was left out. So Jesus was probably born, according to our calendar, 4 to 6 BC, which was what I just loved it, because remember, any of you remember Y2K?
Oh, yeah.
And the horror of that? Yeah. Y2K actually was 1996. I mean, that's when it was 2,000 years after the birth of Christ. So anyway, it just tells you God's not on our calendar. Yes?
I've just taken care of those 4 years in the middle. It's still zeros when he's born, 33 AD is the other, and then there was just some other problems.
Yeah. Well, I just go ahead and back it up, and it's nice to remember 30, for me anyway, 30 AD. So most of these at the time Paul's writing this are still alive, with kind of a slight note of regret that Paul says most of them are still living, though some have fallen asleep. There's some of those that have died. The beauty of that to me is, if you wanted to, you could go back to Judea or Galilee and talk to people who are still alive, who were eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. Man, that'd be on my bucket list if I'm in Corinth. I would want to go and talk to those people. And listen, all of those people, as he is going to be talking about, all of them died, the ones that died, all died in hope of the resurrection for themselves. Because they had seen the risen Christ and knew his promise to them that they would rise.
Then they had quite a few people who had gone on to Antioch and things, and then I'm assuming that there were others who were there that went back to their homes.
Yeah.
In Damascus.
Yeah.
So they may have actually met some of those folks.
Right. Yes, and I suppose that's true. I hadn't thought about that. You're talking about people that were converted on the day of Pentecost. If they were among those that saw Jesus prior to that, I don't know how many of them there would have been. I know there was 120 disciples in Acts 2, but there must have been a large number there available still. That may have gone back to Galilee too. You're right about that. Then who's next? Pardon me? Be bold. James. And again, we don't know when this occurred. It's not recorded any other place that Jesus actually appeared to James. And which James would this be? Yeah, James the Lord's brother. In fact, if you go back to John chapter 7, and I'm not going to take the time to read that whole text, but in verses 2 through 9, Jesus' brothers did not believe in him. Verse 4, no one wants to become a public figure, acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world. For even his own brothers did not believe in him. So up until the time of Jesus' death and burial and the resurrection, at that point in time, it doesn't appear that James believed. But if you go back to Acts chapter 1 and verse 14, after the fact, when it talks about they're all joined together constantly in prayer, the disciples, the apostles there, along with the women, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. So somewhere along the line, Jesus appeared to his family, his physical family, of which James would have been, from our point of view, a prominent person because he's going to become a leader in the church in Jerusalem. Yes, Tim?
Well, that was my question. Where was James? I was wondering if the family was in Nazareth or...
Well, you know, when Jesus was raised, he told Mary to tell the disciples where would he meet them? In Galilee. So I'm assuming they were still up there. And so he would have appeared to them then. And being good, faithful Jews, they would have been in Jerusalem for the Passover. And they would have seen him die. Mary was there. I'm sure that his brothers were there. The first interaction of Paul with James is recorded in Galatians chapter 1.
Quick question.
Yes.
Jesus on his way to the cross, essentially, I thought, said to John, here's your mother, right? Didn't he give care of his mother to John?
Well, that's if you believe that John's the writer of the Gospel of John. But John is not Jesus' brother.
Right, so, but he had several brothers.
Right.
So,
But they weren't believers. So why would you give your mother into the hand of unbelievers? Mary believed. Every time something happened, she put it in her heart. But yeah.
I just hadn't thought about that because he's got brothers here, but yet he's giving his
Right.
mother to the care of
Right.
that person.
Right. Yeah, he gave the care of his mother to someone other than one of his siblings. Who has Galatians 1, verse 19? Read it for me.
Where did you say?
Galatians 1, verse 19. Go ahead, Daniel.
But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother.
Okay. So that's the first time that Paul mentions any interaction with James, the Lord's brother. And I think this would be, under what circumstance would he have met him before? So that makes my mind work. So he goes to Jerusalem. This is his first trip into Jerusalem since his conversion. 3 years in Arabia, whatever part of 3 years he's gone. Parts of 3 calendar years anyway. Comes back and goes down to Jerusalem. And there doesn't appear to be any other apostles besides Peter, which he mentions in verse 18, and he stayed with him for 15 days. But he didn't see any of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But I was trying to picture what that was. And so, I mean, maybe they shared. Maybe Paul shared with him how Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus, and James said, well, this is how he appeared to me and my family. And so that's how Paul can write here that he did appear to James, and he could put it into the order of things that he had. And then what's the next one?
All the apostles.
Then to all the apostles. So, if this means when he met with them all at once, all of the apostles, not just 10 of them, but 11 in the sense that now Thomas is there, when would that have occurred?
Ascension.
Pardon me?
Ascension.
No? When did he meet with, when was Thomas with them the next time he met with all of them? One week later. That was 1 week later after his initial appearance. Tim, do you have a comment?
No, not now.
Okay. That's covered for us in John, the Gospel of John.
Hey, Dan,
Yes.
if they hadn't drawn lots for the other apostle to take Judas's place then, so,
Well, that's not even going to happen until after Jesus' ascension. Yeah.
so when he says all the apostles, all that were apostles.
Right. So that would have been 11. Yeah. Tim, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I was just also thinking about the cast your net on the other side story. At the end of John, and then,
Oh, when he's fishing?
yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if all of them were up there then. May have been. Anyway, to me, that seems out of order to put that appearance 1 week later after he appeared to 500 at once. That doesn't seem to fit into the chronology, if there's actually a chronology here. And again, the chronological language Paul's using kind of indicates that he is. So then to all the apostles could include the appearance to James. Looking at how Paul refers to him in Galatians 1, I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So using the word apostle in a broader sense than just the 12, which could have then been also, there would have been men there like Judas or Justus and Matthias, who's going to become an apostle. And again, I think at once is implied in this text. Let me get back to 1 Corinthians 15 out of Galatians 1. When he says that then he appeared then to all the apostles, I think implied there is at one time. What I think is when he says then to all the apostles, I think what Paul is referring to is at the Mount of Olives just before he ascended. Right at the end of his time here. That he gathered all of them and they watched him in Acts chapter 1 and Mark chapter 20, or Luke chapter 24. Yes?
Yeah, because that's the term that Luke uses in Acts 1 is the apostle.
Right. Right. And so then when he says then to all the apostles, that would be the last time that they would see him on earth. And so that's what that references. That's just my opinion. I can't tell you any more than that. That makes the most sense to me if I'm going to try to fit this into a chronology. Daniel?
Where do you think the appearance to the disciples on the Sea of Tiberias fits in? Because it says in John he appeared to all of the disciples later, says sometime later.
Right.
He appeared to them. That seems to be another.
Well, he's going to be with them for 40 days. I don't think that it was 40 solid days of him being with them. I think he was there and he was not, and he was with them and he was not. So there was a number of occasions, but which is why I think when Paul says, then to all the apostles, I think his mind is taking us all the way to the end of that 40-day period that he was with them and ascended. And then you have 10 days until you have Pentecost. But the last thing that he did on earth was he appeared to them and gave them their commission.
Can you remind me, they were all there for that
Right.
second giving
Right.
of the commission?
Everybody was there, and I think probably more than just the apostles, because I think Matthias and is it Justus? Isn't he the one that's mentioned in Acts 1 as the two that they put forward? As who have been with us from the beginning to the end, they would have necessarily been there. They would have been at the Last Supper as well, to be a witness of all of those things that are going on. Somebody else had their hand up over here. Anybody? Tim?
I was just wondering, like we saw in Galatians, this was something Paul had heard about or had discussed with James about his side. And so these would have been things that Paul would have had knowledge of, kind of milestone things.
Right.
That got me thinking about that group with the 500 present. I just wondered where because he would have been wanting to persecute.
Yeah. I think a lot of the things that we're seeing here are things that Paul either heard from other witnesses or were actually just revealed to him that happened. He didn't have to have a human person telling him some of these things. All right. So last of all, he said what?
Himself.
Last of all, he appeared to me. And that's not the only appearance. Yes, Sam?
Yeah, I'm kind of confused, I guess, because I'm stuck on the chronology. It seems like the point of a lot of this section of passage is that we're talking about all these people that saw him after he died and was walking the earth before,
Right.
in that time prior to his ascension.
Right.
But then he's now talking about how, oh yeah, and I have seen him,
Right.
which I had always assumed was referring to like Acts 9. when-
It is. You're exactly right.
Isn't Acts 9, and Acts 9's after Acts 7, and we
Right.
talk about Jesus standing at the Father's throne, so I would assume that means that when Paul sees him, he's already ascended.
Right.
I'm missing something.
Right. No, you're right.
So,
But he appeared to Paul. I mean, I know Stephen saw him standing at the right hand of God. So there's another appearance of a person who probably knew of Jesus and knew that he had died and sees him there. I know he's going to appear to Paul again in Acts 18th chapter. He's going to be standing right there. He said, "The Lord stood by me and said, 'You will go to Rome.'" So I mean, there is another one.
yeah, it just doesn't seem to fit with the narrative, even the Oriental narrative that I normally think of talking about, see, he's a real body, we saw him.
Right.
Now we're talking about vision thing.
How do you know it's a vision?
Well, I guess I don't know.
Well, Paul said, "I saw him." So I'll just take his word for it. He said, "I saw the Lord." Who are you, Lord? Well, I'm the one you're persecuting. So in whatever way, Jesus now has come back and is in front of Saul of Tarsus, and he saw Jesus, he saw him alive. And, you know, I'm guessing, maybe it's incorrect, but I think Paul was probably around when he died.
Yeah, I guess it's my
Yeah.
epiphany I was having as we went through, was like, well, maybe Paul.
Well, and that's a really good question to ask, though, Sam, because what Paul is going to be dealing with here with the Corinthians is they do not believe in a bodily resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, and I guess that's where I'm getting hung up, because I've got the presumption, you may be right and I'm wrong, that.
That it was just a vision.
Acts 9,
Yeah.
that was a spiritual vision.
Right.
Not
Right.
I'm standing here beside you, hand me a hand sandwich.
Right. Yeah.
You know.
And for me to make this make sense in Paul's argument, that he's going to be presenting that Jesus died, that body that died was buried, and that buried body was raised, for Paul to say, "I saw him too," has to be that body that he saw Jesus in. Whatever it looks like, whatever it is. Yeah.
A struggle there.
Well, and I'm glad you brought it up, because that gets right to the root of what Paul is dealing with here with the Corinthians. Yes.
The reality was enough for him to do a 180.
Oh man, yeah. Liz?
Could Paul have seen him in the 40 days by any chance? Because going back to Acts 9, it said, my version at least says, Saul got up and he could hear him, but he couldn't see him. So, like, could he have seen him when Jesus was here in the 40 days? Like,
It's possible. Yeah, it's possible. I mean, what's Jesus going to say to Paul, who was then Saul, I think it's in either Acts 22 or Acts 26. He said, "It's hard for you to do what? Kick against the goats. To reject what you know is the truth." So could he have seen him there? I think so. Except, and the only reason I don't include that in here is because of the way Paul describes himself as to what happened when he saw Jesus initially, at least it seems to me here. Tim?
I realize it's speculation, but that's why I was alluding to the fact of, could Paul have been back there, behind when there was this 500 people there? I mean, obviously, he's not gonna try to, go in and
Arrest 500 people.
exactly, but
Yeah.
he could have
Right.
been there.
Right. Well, and again, if he did see that, if he did see as Liz saw during that 40 days, he's still denying it. He's still mentally not accepting it. So I think Paul is talking about what happened in Acts 9 when he appeared to him. I think he's talking about when he was commissioned to become an apostle. That's the last. And there is such a tone of deep humility here, because how does he describe himself in this appearance? Okay, one untimely born. My translation says as one abnormally born. The Greek word here is ektroma, E-K-T-R-O-M-A, and it means a miscarriage, or as a dead fetus is how he's describing himself here, a lifeless birth. And so, not just one that was early and survived, but as a lifeless birth. This is kind of interesting because any of you know what the word Paulus means? I didn't know this, but I thought maybe some of you were better students than me. It means little one. Paulus means little one. I don't know if I remember reading somewhere that Paul being described as having dwarf-like features or being a small person. So Paul is actually saying, not only that, and that's kind of the view that the Corinthians had toward Paul. He's not a big guy. He's not a main person. He's not a large personality. He's Paulus. He's just a little guy. And so Paul, kind of going along with that, says, not only that, I'm a preemie. I'm a preemie that didn't survive. And the Corinthians all through this have had doubts about Paul's apostleship, and he may be playing into that here, kind of acknowledging that. He's going to carry that same theme forward here for a few verses. And listen, his whole argumentation about his apostleship is finally, Paul's going to let it come to a head, and he's going to deal with that in 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13. He's just going to absolutely nail the coffin shut on that argument there. But he says he is an apostle. He writes from that position of authority because of God's grace. Because what did he say there in the end of verse 8?
One born out of due time.
Okay, right before that. The last of all, he what?
Of me also as of one born out of due time.
He's still too far. He appeared to me. He appeared to me. Did he appear to Peter? Did he appear to James, who was a big pillar in the church in Jerusalem? Did he appear to 500 brethren at once? Did he appear to the 12? Did he appear to all of them at once? He appeared to me too. That's what he's saying. I am an apostle because he appeared to me too. So we have that kind of bridge that goes from the 12 to Paul, and just the relationship that carried with it. So let's move on to any other comments on that. What did Paul say about himself relative to the other apostles, and what gospel did they all preach in verses 9 through 7? What does he say with relationship to the other apostles? Of the apostles, I am the least. But he's still saying of the apostles, I'm not just the least, I'm also an apostle. I mean, if you take the class and you want to put me at the least, that's fine. That gets back to little Paul here, you know, the one untimely born, but I'm still an apostle. And again, from their standpoint, he may be the least. In fact, he's going to add what to that? Yeah, I don't deserve it. I don't deserve to be called an apostle. And his reason for not deserving to be an apostle is different from the reason the Corinthians would assign him for not being a disciple. Their reasons would be, well, because he's kind of weak in his presence. He didn't demand monetary support. Remember when we covered that? You know, if you were a real apostle, you would make us pay you when you were here. They think that they see his lack of spirituality as a part of that criteria. He doesn't come with eloquence. Chapters 4, verses 1 through 5, they're obviously judging him. He says, I don't care if you judge me or not. We've seen that all through this book. Paul's reason for being the least of the apostles and not deserving it was what? Because he persecuted the church. So because of his former life, not because of the way he is now, or even in regard to the other apostles, but because of what he did before. And listen, Paul, just like all of the rest of us, are what we are now because of what? God's grace. That's the one thing that we all share in that. And if the Corinthians don't like his status or his office, who can they argue with? Who's Paul saying they can argue with? God. You don't have an argument with me. God's the one who made me an apostle. Jesus is the one who made me an apostle. I'm here by God's grace. You have a problem with that, talk to God about it. Yes, Otto.
You know, Paul's admission that the guilt that he held makes us, I mean, that gives us a reason to wonder about our previous lives, how we can look back and still feel that same guilt.
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's there.
Yeah. I mean, here's these guys, they were with Jesus the whole time and 24/7 for 3 years. And first rattle out of the bag, Paul's trying to destroy everything that Jesus tried to build and the apostles were trying to build. And yet, Jesus came in and snatched him and used him. Jonathan?
I was going to say, I mean, he almost takes their side of it. You know, I don't even deserve, you know, you say I'm not an apostle. I don't think I deserve to be an apostle.
Right.
But God has
Right.
me here.
Even though I don't deserve to be an apostle, guess what? I am one. And I didn't become one because of my choice or because of my ambition. In fact, it happened in spite of what I would have thought. Paul uses grace here in two different ways. He says, by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them. The first one has to do with his salvation. That God reached out and saved him. And the second one has to do with his ministry and the office and the power that was given to him to fulfill his commission as an apostle. So he talks about his humble and undeserved position. The grace of God, I persecuted the church, but by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. And though he had this humble and undeserved beginning, it had an amazing impact on him. God took Saul's formidable energy. I mean, he was all in on destroying the church and on persecuting Christians and this unending drive to try to destroy it. And he turned that around, as Tim said a minute ago, and now he's 180 degrees preaching the gospel that he was once against, which caused him to work harder than all of them. He looked at what he had been, amazed at what God did for him, and you know, you can't make up for your past, but Paul used that as a motivation for him to do what he did.
Hey, Dan.
Yes.
Don't you think that tenacity that caused him to persecute the church, and then when he obeyed the gospel, he had that same tenacity to do it.
Yeah.
It caused the Jews to hate him even more, because he's not only denying what, or getting away from what we want, he is destroying what we're doing.
Right. Paul was a person who absolutely acted on his faith. Absolutely. Even when it was wrong. But he just knew Jesus was a blasphemer, and people that were following were blasphemous people, and he needed to rid the earth of them. And then he took that grace of God, which he said was not in vain. What God did for me was not in vain. Terry?
I think that's really relatable today. All through time, actually. I read the other day, a young woman had posted a question on the Church of Christ Facebook page, just like throughout the United States. And she was a young mom, and she was saying how, although she grew up in the church, and what she knew is because of what she was taught, and she never really did anything like terrible or horrible, but yet she became a Christian. And she was asking, how do I teach, that to my children to have their own faith? Because she said, now as a 30-year-old, I'm figuring out what having your own faith means. And sometimes I think it's not a disservice, like if you raise your children in the church, that's
Right.
wonderful if you can do that, but I wasn't raised in the church, and I know many other people weren't either, and sometimes when you have a past or you come from the other side,
Right.
you appreciate it differently.
Yeah.
And
It is, and that's it. It's different.
yeah.
Yeah. And I used to think that too. And if I'd just been a really horrible sinner when I came to the Lord, it had a completely different, I used to think that. But look at the advantages that I had. And so I didn't make the horrible mistakes. So the one drawback that could possibly be is, well, I wasn't saved from much because I was a pretty good guy, and that's not the way it is at all. I was still a sinner. I still needed salvation. But you have to see that there's a positive side to that too. And so you don't envy the people that had a sinful life and came to the Lord, just like you don't envy the ones that were raised in the church and didn't have the problems or have to suffer some of the things that you suffered. John?
Paul's going to somewhat talk about that when he's talking about Jews and Gentiles. The Jews had the promises. The Jews had the
Right. Right. Tim?
Parable of the two debtors, maybe?
Parable of the two?
Debtors.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Still a debt. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, anyway, so it did have an effect on him. He didn't take it in vain. And I think all of us have seen evidence of that. In Paul's case, the effect was hard work, exerted on the Lord's behalf, a whole life just, and 2 Corinthians 11 and 12, he talks about all that he suffered for him. Daniel?
One thing that really stands out to me about this thought that he's making is that it helps us to appreciate when God has given us opportunities that we feel ill-equipped for, which is how Paul felt, like, who am I to serve
Right.
this role? Well, God chose him. And I think that happens to us a lot. We're thrown into opportunities to share the gospel with someone, to mentor someone, stuff like that. We just feel very, like, why me? There's many people better than me to do this. But to realize, like Paul did, that whether it's deserved, merited, or not, God has given us His grace, and His
Right.
grace will be sufficient to
Right.
carry it out. So it's not reliant on me having the skills or the, experience. It's reliant on God's grace. So
Right.
important.
I've got a sermon planned here in the next month or two on Moses. What was Moses' opinion about God choosing him to go free the people? Not me. You picked the wrong guy. And really what it turned out, he's the only guy. He was the only one qualified. He was the perfect guy. And so, again, Paul's effect was hard work exerted on behalf of the Lord, but that was by God's grace, which kind of seems like a paradox, hard work and God's grace. And so I'm glad I got a chance to share this with you. So an illustration by a couple of guys that wrote commentaries, Robertson and Plumbers, said, from a human point of view, Paul saying, I worked hard, and my hard work came about as a result of God's grace. They said from a human point of view, it is as the joy of a child who gives his father a birthday present bought with his father's money. Okay, so, Dad, I need $20, and so he goes out and buys his dad a birthday present and then gives it to him. And he's so excited that he was able to share this present with his father. So the present actually came about as a result of the father's grace, but there's the hard work that the boy put into doing to please his dad. And I thought, man, that's just a perfect illustration of that, better than what I could have come up with. So we'll start next week with what I have down here as the bottom line of what Paul's saying here in this section, and which is the point that my last part of that question is, which is what gospel did they all preach? And we'll cover that. Thank you. You didn't have to run me off, Sam. I would leave.
I was checking to make sure this monitor was actually on, because it's embarrassing that I sing from the monitor up here, and when it's off, it doesn't work as well. So we're going to sing number 219 before Josh Ralston gives us an invitation. Shall we sing? All day long, Jesus, I am singing. He, my song of joy will ever be. All the while, He keeps my heart bells ringing. For His love is everything to me. Streams of love around my soul are flowing. From His heart, love's everlasting spring. That is why my faith in Him I'm showing. That is why an endless song I sing. In His light I'm going home to glory. With a soul to trust His saving grace. Going home to sing and tell His story. In the blessed sunshine of His face. He is my King, and oh, I dearly love Him. He's my glorious King, no other is above Him. All day long, in raptured praise I sing, I sing. He's my blessed Savior, He's my King. Thank you. Josh?
Good evening, church.